Once upon a time, in a modern city where everyone drove cars, there lived an old lady named Juliette. Juliette was not like other people in the city who zoomed around in their cars. She had a donkey named Biscuit, who she rode everywhere she went, and her pet monkey named Chester would always come along for the ride. People in the city thought that Juliette was crazy for riding a donkey instead of driving a car. They would point and stare at her as she rode past, and some would even laugh. But Juliette didn't care. She loved Biscuit and Chester, and they were the best companions she could ask for. One day, as Juliette was riding Biscuit through the city, she noticed something strange. Every petrol station she passed was completely out of petrol. Cars were lined up for miles, waiting to fill their tanks, but there was none to be found. Juliette knew that this was a big problem. Without petrol, people couldn't drive their cars, and they would be stranded. But Juliette and her trusty donkey Biscuit didn't need petrol. They could go anywhere they wanted, as long as they had each other. As the days passed, more and more people began to realize the value of Juliette's unconventional mode of transportation. They saw her riding through the streets, with Chester perched on her shoulder, and they realized that she was onto something. They started to appreciate the simplicity of riding a donkey and the joy it could bring. Soon, Juliette became somewhat of a celebrity in the city. People would stop her on the street to ask for her autograph, and children would come up to pet Biscuit and Chester. Juliette was happy to share her love of animals and her old-fashioned way of life with others. But Juliette knew that this newfound appreciation for donkeys and monkeys wouldn't last forever. Eventually the petrol stations would be restocked, and people would go back to driving their cars. So she decided to teach a lesson to the people of the city, one that they would never forget. One day, Juliette organized a race through the city from one end to the other. The catch was that the only vehicles allowed were donkeys, horses, and bicycles. Everyone was welcome to participate, and there was even a prize for the winner. People were skeptical at first, but as the race began, they started to see the fun in it. The sound of donkeys braying and horses neighing filled the air, and the streets were alive with activity. Children cheered on their parents, and friends raced against each other, all with smiles on their faces. In the end, the winner of the race was a young boy who rode his bicycle faster than anyone else. But the real winner was the city itself. People had come together to celebrate a simpler, more joyful way of life, one that didn't rely on petrol or shiny cars. From that day on, the people of the city had a newfound appreciation for the old-fashioned way of life that Juliette had been living all along. They still drove their cars, of course, but they also rode bicycles and even took their donkeys and horses out for a spin. And whenever they saw Juliette riding Biscuit through the streets, they would wave and smile, knowing that she was a true inspiration to them all. As the city continued to embrace the simple pleasures of life, Juliette's popularity grew even more. She was often invited to speak at events and schools, where she shared stories about her adventures with Biscuit and Chester. Children were always fascinated by the idea of riding a donkey through the city, and they loved hearing about the mischievous things that Chester would do on their trips. One day, Juliette was invited to speak at a large event in the city center. The event was all about sustainable living, and Juliette was the perfect person to talk about how to live a simpler, more environmentally friendly life. As Juliette made her way to the event, she saw that there was a huge traffic jam in the streets. Cars were honking, people were shouting, and there was chaos everywhere. But Juliette and Biscuit just calmly walked through the crowds, and people couldn't help but smile as they passed by. When Juliette arrived at the event, she saw that there were hundreds of people waiting to hear her speak. She climbed up onto the stage, with Biscuit and Chester by her side, and began to speak. "Hello, everyone," she said. "I am here to talk to you today about the beauty of simple living. I ride a donkey through the city, and people think I'm crazy, but I'm not crazy. I'm just living the way that people used to live. And guess what? It's a wonderful way to live." The crowd listened intently as Juliette spoke. She told them about the joys of riding a donkey, about the sound of the hooves on the pavement and the wind in your hair. She talked about the importance of taking care of the planet and how riding a donkey was just one small way to make a difference. After her speech, people came up to Juliette and thanked her for inspiring them. They told her that they had never thought about living a simpler life, but now they wanted to try it. Some even asked if they could take a ride on Biscuit, and Juliette was happy to oblige. As Juliette and Biscuit rode home that day, she felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had shown people that there was another way to live, one that didn't involve fancy cars or material possessions. She had shown them the beauty of a life lived with intention, and she knew that she had made a difference. From that day on, the people of the city continued to embrace a simpler way of life. They rode their bikes, walked more, and even got their own donkeys and horses. They had realized that there was something special about the old-fashioned way of doing things, and they were grateful to Juliette for showing them the way. As for Juliette, she continued to ride Biscuit through the streets of the city with Chester by her side. She was happy and content, knowing that she had made a positive impact on the world, and every time someone smiled and waved at her, she knew that she was doing something right. The end.